Morning, Sarah. Morning, Mira.
Hi.
Hello.
Morning.
I just jumped off another call. I need to go grab my blazer and put some lipstick on. I will be right back. This one is throwing me off because I'm not used to having trainings first thing in the morning. They're usually midday. So I'm like,
yeah, like what we have right now.
Exactly. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
And have you heard anything from Renata? Probably not.
No, I haven't. And you know how you sent the text string and there's a bunch of numbers? Is she on that?
Yes, she is, but nobody responded to my message. So I was like, did I do it wrong?
Okay, I didn't know. I should have done that, but I
On
realized
the last one I sent that says third try, I tried to include you multiple times and I kept getting your number. My phone was being weird. So I just, you probably you didn't get the full message, I think.
Well, I'm just responding now.
Okay.
But I didn't have Renata's cell phone, so I didn't add it. But
Got it. Okay, let me show you. Let me tell you which one she is.
There she is.
Oh, good. Yay, Renata. Awesome.
Oh, my reply didn't go through. Weird.
I stayed back because it was like, oh my God, I don't want to be stretching. And then I stayed, and now I have like really spotty.
That is essentially trauma-informed lawyering that we will be covering today. And trauma-informed lawyering is also when attorneys employ methods of self-care to prevent and address vicarious trauma. So those are the two aspects. The 4 hallmarks of trauma-informed lawyering are understanding trauma and how it impacts your clients, adjusting attorney-client relationship, adapting case strategy, and preventing, addressing, and transforming vicarious trauma.
Thank you, Mariana. This is Joel Shapiro with the Trafficking Law Center. I will handle the next few slides. And as Mariana pointed out, trauma will affect your client. If you're working with a survivor of trafficking, it's a guarantee that they've been through significant trauma. But I would add that even in your normal practice, if you are not representing trafficking survivors, you're likely going to encounter clients who have been through trauma. And so understanding the basics of trauma, how it affects your client, how you can improve your working relationship with the client is very important. And as a side note, given that there are a lot of clients out there who have dealt with trauma and that can have a significant impact on how they relate to you and how you relate to them, I think there's a good argument that under our ethical requirements as lawyers to be competent, it's important to know and understand a little bit about trauma and its impacts on victims. If we can go to the next slide. So we often use trauma fairly colloquially, but there is a clinical definition of trauma. There are a lot of good resources out there on trauma. I think probably the most authoritative source is SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They define trauma as they define it that trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So that is the clinical definition of trauma. And we talk about trauma response in terms of the 3 E's. So that is an event or events, how the person experiences those events, and then what are the effects of that trauma. So trauma has a distinct physiological effect on the brain. And so again, trauma is a word that's often used colloquially, but we're really talking about what is happening in the brain during and after trauma. And so trauma can have different effects on different people experiencing the same event. 2 people might have very different reactions, and one might experience a lot of trauma and the other one might not have a trauma response. And another point to know is that not everyone who experiences trauma, in fact, the vast majority of people who experience trauma do not develop PTSD. So understanding what's happening in the brain when a person is experiencing trauma is really important. There are different parts of the brain that are activated during trauma and other parts of the brain that are essentially offline. And so your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that controls executive function, that makes a lot of rational decisions, is essentially shut down because your body and brain are reacting to the traumatic event or experience that's occurring. And one way to think of it is that it's really relying on sort of earlier evolutionary parts of your brain. So we talk about the hippocampus and the amygdala as really being activated, and what your brain is using when it is in a trauma state. So your brain is really in a survival mode. We used to talk about fight or flight. Now we use the phrase fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Those are the typical trauma responses that your brain is implementing when it's experiencing trauma. If we can move on to the next slide. There are, oops, I think we, there we go. Because of the parts of the brain that are being utilized, there are certain things that occur during the trauma. So as I mentioned, your executive functioning is impaired. Your ability to remember, to encode information is going to be reduced, and that's really important. We'll touch upon that more. Sometimes people will have experiences such as sort of hypervigilance. Their vision will be narrowed. Peripheral information is not getting stored in your memory. An extreme response is what's called dissociation, where you're not really aware of your surroundings and your brain is sort of functioning internally, going through its own thoughts, but not responding to the external situation. There are lots and lots of symptoms of trauma. Not, as I said, not everyone is going to respond the same way. And an individual person may not respond to trauma the same way every time they experience trauma. But there are some very common responses to be aware of for trauma. So re-experiencing the event, replaying it in your mind, it can manifest through nightmares, flashbacks. It can certainly cause significant emotional reactions. So typical trauma responses can include depression, anxiety, fear, anger, sadness, and numbness. There are things that can trigger or remind the person of that trauma, and it may not be obvious to somebody else that something is going to be a trauma trigger. And so one of the things that can be helpful is for that person to try to avoid the things that are going to be triggering, like a location or certain people or even colors or smells can induce triggering. So when somebody is triggered, then they can have reactions that are difficult to control and that can be surprising to somebody from the outside. And so it's important to understand triggering so that if your client does get triggered and even goes into dissociation, that you understand what's happening and try to bring them back to the present moment. And so if somebody is seeming like they're not able to pay attention, if they are all of a sudden agitated, if they seem anxious or afraid, that may be a sign of trauma. Trauma can also affect them in their ongoing daily events, having an inability to sleep, having an easy startle response, losing interest in eating, sex, conversation. Those are all symptoms of trauma. And so again, it's important to understand that. And we're not going to go too deeply into that, but if somebody is triggered, you want to bring them back to the current situation by, for example, offering them a drink, something tactile that may help them recenter their thoughts, and just ask them, what is the last thing that you remembered me saying to you? Something like that can sort of bring them back. I think we can move on to the next one, and that will wrap up my portion.
Thanks, Joel. Hi, everyone. I'm Renata Paris. I'm pro bono counsel for Paul Hastings. And the next few slides I'm going to cover, and I'm going to preface all of this by the fact that this certainly could be the basis of its own hours-long training. And there are a lot of people who specialize in these concepts that are not me. And but it's a pleasure to be here with the collective today. I come at this from two different perspectives. One is having formerly been with the federal government, where I worked on human rights prosecutions with witnesses, and now as pro bono counsel as a survivor advocate and direct representation of survivors. So to jump into my portion of the slides, what we're going to talk about are other types of trauma that may be more broad sweeping, but no less important, and certainly affect the daily lives of many of our clients and those individuals with whom we work. We often think about trauma as a direct event that happened directly to one person, and surely that exists, and that's what we are primarily focused on. But these are going to cover some other more peripheral types of trauma that affect people no less. So something called societal trauma, we're all experiencing that right now. Societal trauma is what we're all undergoing with the pandemic and all sorts of other crises that are ongoing in the world. It's otherwise referred to sometimes as collective trauma. It refers to a traumatic event that is shared by a group of people. The trauma can occur at varying levels and in different forms. So we may be talking about societal level as far as one country. In my former capacity with the Department of Homeland Security, I worked with a lot of populations that went through war, that went through major conflicts, that affected entire nation states, where everybody within that country had some level of societal trauma. You can also talk about it, global trauma, the pandemic, right? And then within that society level traumatic experience, there are identity subgroups. So there may be groups based on tribes, ethnic minorities, family units, the list goes on, but not everybody within that societal structure experiences that collective trauma the same way. Collective trauma is very important to understand when you're dealing with individuals, and especially individuals who have gone through traumatic experiences, and maybe individuals who are coming from other geographic locations or other places where they endured certain types of things that perhaps you're not immediately aware of or cognizant of, because collective trauma influences societal culture, It influences mass actions. It influences the political environments in which people lived. It influences the way that they see the world. As I said before, there are whole societies that may suffer from everlasting culture and chronic trauma and pain. I've, in my own personal practice, I have worked with a lot of individuals from countries like Rwanda, South Sudan, where it is very difficult to encounter an individual from one of those countries who has not in some way been affected by some level of pain and chronic trauma. This also plays a key role in identity formation for specific individuals, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but enduring this type of trauma actually can translate into how that individual sees themselves. So it's not just behavioral mechanisms, but it's an actual internalization of identity formation that's going to be very important to understand when you're dealing with that individual on an individual basis. And of course, this passes through generations, which we're going to see segue to the next slide. So to sort of flowing from societal trauma is something called intergenerational trauma. And that refers to the ways in which trauma is passed on literally from generation to generation. I am the daughter of a World War II veteran. My father endured a great deal. So this topic is very interesting to me, and I've lived it in my own personal life. There is what psychologists and people, again, who know this better than I do, call a legacy of trauma. And that means that it carries through from generations. The original traumatic experience endures, and it endures from the original person through their children to their grandchildren. The transmission between parent and child has been broken down into basically what people have categorized into 5 different measures, which comes down to the way they communicate, the way they deal with conflict, the way they see their family structure, the parental warmth, or otherwise known as sort of an attachment theory, and parental involvement. And then the way that you are actually experiencing this intergenerational trauma with those people that you're, residing with or working with, you then develop certain types of adaptive styles. Joel touched on this a little bit when you're talking about direct traumatic experiences, things like disassociation, aggression, numbness, right? These are also adaptive styles that translate within intergenerational trauma. So there are, let's say you grow up with a mother who went through war. There may be an overly protective parenting style that she has come into your relationship with that you are going to adapt to. And there are different ways to adapt to that. And there's different behavioral mechanisms, things like numbness, detachment, a real need to control your own environment, a complete intolerance of weakness. I think, again, if you've worked with certain populations of people who have endured war, there is this mentality that you suck it up, right? The conspiracy of silence within families when something traumatic has happened, maybe not societally, but within a subgroup, a family unit. And certainly when you're working with youth or perhaps juvenile clients, and I know this is in the context of human trafficking survivors, but this can translate to other types of cases, domestic violence, immigration cases, all different types of cases that you may be working on. When you're talking about children, there are behaviors that may manifest, risky health behaviors, anxiety, there's shame, there's potential food hoarding, overeating, this emotional neediness on the part of either the child or the parent, a low level of community trust. If you're growing up with a mother who, again, was, or a father who was in a conflict zone where the police were a real integral part of the conflict, you may have a real distrust of law enforcement that trickles down generationally. And there's this sort of survival mode that comes with this, that someone may be living in a perpetual state of feeling like they're just surviving. You can go to the next slide. a little bit different, but another sort of category of a psychological consequence of trauma is something called trauma bonding. This is something that we were very aware of in my former capacity with the government. And I'm not sure if we have any governmental folks on the line, but you'll understand this too. And now certainly when we're advocating and representing clients, the phenomenon of trauma bonding, a lot of times people immediately go, oh, that's Stockholm syndrome. Stockholm syndrome is just one kind of trauma bonding. Trauma bonding refers to any type of attachment that is created between you and someone causing you trauma. So it's a psychological response to abuse. It really refers to the emotional bond that is created. As unhealthy as it is, there is an emotional bond that's created with the individual that is occurring, that is recurring, it's cyclical, and it goes in waves with the pattern of abuse. And the way that really manifests is through this series of rewards and punishments. So someone will punish you and you feel shame, and then on the other side of the spectrum, they'll reward you and you feel a sense of happiness. And it really develops due to this power imbalance that happens in the very structures that we're talking about. Things like someone who is trapped in a situation of human enslavement or human trafficking, there is an inherent power imbalance to that relationship. And so this positive and negative interaction, the dependence that the survivor has on their human trafficker, the self-blame that comes with just human identity and their own past history. So whatever it is that they have brought into this situation in the first place from just their lives prior to coming into this situation. And again, this can really occur in a variety of different types of relationships. So oftentimes we think about it in terms of romantic relationships, but it needn't only be that. This can be parent-child. This can be elder abuse, geriatric populations living within certain environments, labor exploitation, human trafficking. So there's really a need for practitioners and law enforcement and criminal justice professionals to really understand trauma bonding in your practice. What are the common indicators of trauma and what do you really need to look out for? So these are things when you're going in and you're interviewing your client, how are these things going to manifest, right? Lack of communication skills, a reluctance to talk about personal events, memory issues involved in traumatic moments. That's Joel had already touched on this with disassociation. An inability to really separate between who can be trusted and who can't. That goes back to trauma bonding. They may actually have developed extreme levels of trust in people that we think they should not have. This unreasonable aggressive behavior, again, that goes back to triggering. An inability to properly manage distressing emotions. That ability to emotionally manage has really disappeared. Contradictory beliefs and actions. 1 minute they're saying one thing and the next minute they're saying another. What's the truth? A lack of proper sense of personal boundaries and being overly obedient or unwilling to comply with authority, which we touched on earlier. These are the mental health disorders that oftentimes relate to trauma. I'm not going to go too far into this. These are things that are more, you can find, but obviously things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, disassociation, delusions, some mood instabilities, bipolar disorder, physical and chronic health problems. And again, these diagnoses, they manifest in these ways. We're going to see the same types of behaviors over and over: memory issues, aggressive behavior, unhealthy relationships, boundary issues, they're missing appointments, their challenges functioning in society, they don't show up to work, they're sleeping late, unable to provide for themselves and their families, can't keep a steady employment. Certainly the engagement in criminal behavior that has developed as a survival mechanism, and this self-medication, so substance abuse. And I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague.
And actually, if I could jump back in just really quickly, one thing that I didn't really touch on enough in my part of the trauma is that the ability to remember things in a linear, sequential, organized manner is really impacted by trauma. And so if you're working with a client and they can't tell you exactly what happened in a linear way, that doesn't mean that they are making it up or that they're not reliable. That is just an impact of the trauma.
Thank you, Joel. That's so important. And, so often in our legal system, we're taught that, if somebody tells you, different stories at different times, maybe they're a witness being interviewed or a defendant that's being interviewed, that goes to their credibility, our entire legal system. And, the credibility of your cases relies on your witnesses, your, the parties that were involved in whatever the legal matter. And if they can't remember what happened or they say things differently in different times, that's a sign that they've experienced trauma, not a sign that they're not a credible witness. But our legal system very rarely acknowledges and understands that reality. So what tends to happen, unfortunately, particularly to our client population, is that those who are victims of crime, who have experienced very traumatic things, are too often criminalized within our legal system. And it goes to the exact symptoms of trauma that both Joel and Renata were just discussing. And there's a ton of research that backs this up, and we can include some in your materials that follow this. Most notably, there's a study from Georgetown Law that's called the Abuse to Prison Pipeline Study, and it really, in depth explains what this slide just briefly touches on, which is oftentimes behavior as minors is essentially leads individuals or youth on a path to much more serious charges as adults, because they're labeled a criminal, they're put on a certain path that they then just are, this is the system that they're in continues to treat them as a criminal, as opposed to as a child who's experienced trauma. Very often, as Joel was talking about, that if somebody is triggered, their fight or flight response is going to kick in. And that means that if somebody has experienced trauma, they very well may respond violently because they've experienced trauma. That is a completely natural human response to trauma and to somebody's experienced trauma. And then that can lead to, people engaging in what may look like disproportionately violent behavior in the situation that they're in, which ultimately leads to them being criminalized for that violent behavior. And so that we then, with our client population of a very traumatized population that experienced trauma very often before they were trafficked and then during their trafficking, are going to unfortunately have extensive criminal records for these issues that have come up. And so in working with this client population, it's important to understand how often our society has criminalized behavior that is directly tied to their trauma.
In this section, we will address how to work with the trauma response and ways to build trust with the client and vicarious trauma. And as Joel had mentioned earlier, having the skills to work with trauma in a legal setting supports successful legal representation, and it's also empowering for the attorney to be able to have those tools to engage with individuals who are impacted by trauma, which affects many clients and not just human trafficking survivors. For the impact on the legal process, we have to remember that the trauma response will appear differently with different people based on their history and the background of that individual. And so you may be seeing completely different responses, which are manifestations still of the trauma. And clients are frequently seeking legal assistance at that point in time when they're highly vulnerable and emotional and in need. And they're put in a position where they have to share some of the most intimate and painful details of their lives. The legal process itself can be triggering the trauma response. And so it's really on the attorney to know how to manage that. Just as the trauma responds differently, you may notice that one client may be easily overwhelmed and become upset and tearful, while another client may show little to no emotions. Similarly, as you're building a case, you may need to look out for how one client is overemphasizing certain events, while another is underemphasizing or minimizing the impacts of certain events. And so you want to employ strategies to elicit information that will help the case. And some of that is creating a safe environment and rapport, which is very important. And Sarah will walk you through that. You should also be aware that many clients may feel nervous about meeting you. You want to be aware of the power dynamic and that of the client's past experience with attorneys, whether they share it or not. You should be aware that survivors may have had past negative experiences with attorneys of not being listened to, and they may have in fact been victimized by attorneys, law enforcement, authority figures in the trafficking context itself. So you really want to use your opportunity of representing them to change that dynamic and to model out respect and professionalism while being aware that they are bringing their past history to the table that may make them intimidated of you or nervous or have other responses. Again, rapport and creating a safe environment are important. You want to offer opportunities for the client to make as many choices as possible so they're empowered during the process, so they feel in control. You ask them, would you like water? Would you like to take a break? Other things to be aware of. Oh, there's still a few things on that slide. Yep. Other things to be aware of are that clients may be confused or unresponsive. The memories are not structurally organized, difficulty forming a linear narrative, as discussed earlier, difficulty processing and storing information, inconsistencies in statements, and they may have competing needs going on. And so their focus on the legal process may be disrupted as other issues come up. So moving on to the considerations, starting with some of the practical adjustments is make sure to practice compassionate listening. To help change that dynamic that we spoke of earlier, engage in active listening, ask open-ended questions, really get curious. Make sure, when we say victim-centered or survivor-centered representation, make sure that they are at the center of your attention and you are curious about what their needs are, what their goals are. Use validating language where the client is having an emotional response during your work. Try to validate and rather than blame. And so, or rather than claiming to know what they're going through. So don't say things like, you don't need to be sad. You have nothing to be ashamed of. It's more helpful to say, it's common for individuals who have been through what you have been through to feel this way. Thank you for sharing this difficult information. I am so sorry. Use that kind of reframing language to validate the survivor's experience. Explore alternatives to narrative and engage in creative problem solving where it may be difficult for your client to recount certain events. See if you can obtain certain evidence through other means, medical records or texts to help piece together the story. For yourself too, be mindful of your caseload, the number and the type of cases you're working on because of vicarious trauma considerations. And Jamie later on will point you to some resources and address that. And have other tasks to work on. If you know a client is forgetful or unresponsive, when you're practicing setting boundaries, in the case of if a client is not showing up or you're having other boundary issues, really practice setting boundaries in an empathetic way. Make sure you're not using language that is blaming or can be perceived as a threat of terminating services. You didn't respect my time. If you say things like that, your client may perceive that you're threatening to cease services or you're abandoning them. Try to be more constructive with working within these constraints and ask questions again. You may sort of share your situation and say, if there's a schedule change, it's not a problem. It's just helpful for me to know in advance so I can manage my time. Would you like to check in the morning of our meeting by text? Would something else be helpful? Really partner with your client to see what kind of adjustments can be made. And again, ask questions. Make extra time for in-person interviews. Realize that it may take longer to get into these difficult subjects. Again, offer to take breaks as the client needs. Practice seeing the meaning and the bigger picture of your work. And that's really your work as the attorney to stay connected and stay professional, and know that while these could be very resource intensive cases and maybe emotionally intensive cases, this is very, very impactful work, and you need to employ strategies to stay connected and grounded and strong throughout the process. Again, we'll offer more resources at the end. And next slide.
Thank you, Mariana. As mentioned before, I'm Sarah Byrne. I'm with the Moore and Van Allen Human Trafficking Pro Bono Project in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm thrilled because I know a lot of our project volunteers are on the webinar today. And I'm also really pleased to be a member of the National Survivor Law Collective. So continuing on the theme of how we best deal with clients in a trauma-informed way, I'm going to focus on the very beginning opportunity to develop trust with a client. So all the themes that have been mentioned today should, of course, be weaved into all interactions with clients. But let's focus on that opportunity for trust that starts at that very moment of introduction, whether that's in an in-person intake meeting, over the phone, or virtually. The very beginning of the relationship, it is really important for us to allow our clients to be in control, of course, for all the reasons that you've learned about so far. And that can mean they choose where and when to meet based on their convenience and comfort, who they would like present in that first meeting. Now, of course, we have to be mindful of confidentiality and privilege, but what's most important for this meeting is to, again, establish that trust. So perhaps if they wanted a case manager or other advocate or support person to join you, you could limit the conversation to not include what might be confidential or what we may want to be privileged and protected down the road. There are, of course, exceptions to this, agency and caseworker and translator exceptions, but it's just something to be mindful of when you have a survivor client who would like to include someone else in that initial meeting. So the goal of the first interaction, again, no matter the forum or format, is to develop rapport, to explain your role, and to establish the client's goals for legal representation, knowing very well that those goals may change over time, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. As a first step, my recommendation is always to just begin to explain what you and your firm or your organization has done for survivors in similar circumstances, giving real concrete examples of ways that you've represented other survivors. This has sort of two purposes. It often jogs the memory of the survivor of why you're meeting and what needs he or she may have, but it also helps to develop their trust in your competence to do this work. Oh, this lawyer has done this before, has cleared a criminal record before, and that again will facilitate the relationship. As previously mentioned, it's important to allow time, Mariana said this, to really get to know each other. That's really hard with the kind of jobs that we have, but it's vital for trauma-informed lawyering. And ask about the whole person. Of course, being mindful that we're not doing so in an intrusive way, but really treat the whole person and not just what happened to them at one or many times. At the beginning of the first meeting, it's a best practice to establish what's going to happen next. Be very clear about your expectations for what you are going to do. And of course, that can change based on changing circumstances, but it's important that they know when they can expect to hear from us again. And it's important to talk about what form of communication would work best for the client, but also keeping in mind issues of confidentiality and records retention and productivity, but certainly explain and talk with the client about what would work best for them for follow-up communication. So let's move on to trauma-informed techniques beyond, well, both in the initial meeting, but in all of our interactions. And when we shift to the client beginning to speak, or we begin to perhaps ask questions in the model that we had talked about before, Joel did a great job of focusing on the fact that we ought not ask for a chronological order of events or a linear recitation of the facts. I think we all know at this point that that's not a best practice, but explain confidentiality. And of course, we know to do this quite regularly with clients, but it's a really important piece for building trust with our human trafficking survivor clients. So of course, explain that the communications will likely enjoy confidentiality, but also explain the exceptions that may apply. And folks on this webinar come from all different parts of the country. And as many of us know, the confidentiality rules and the exceptions really vary by state. So I'm going to just mention broadly, you can talk about how the conversation will remain confidential unless certain exceptions apply, which in most states include future harm to self or future harm to others. So you can give actual examples of when you might have to relay something that came up in the conversation, which is of course quite rare. So again, as Joel mentioned, we're not going to ask for a linear recitation of the facts or what happened or why they are here to meet with you or what can we do for you. But if you kind of create this foundation of trust in this rapport, a lot of us that do this work find that the facts that are necessary for the task at hand sort of surface organically. And that happens, I've mentioned it before, but talking about other custody work that you've done for survivors or other expunctions or vacatur work. Last week, we had a criminal record erased for and explain it, but of course, keeping expectations tempered. So importantly, while lawyers often play the role, or we are often titled counselors, we guide our commercial clients that way as counselors, but this is not really the dynamic for trauma-informed lawyering with regard to human trafficking survivors. Our clients' goals lead in this context. We can, of course, offer alternatives to their suggested path, and we can explain that we have found with other clients, it may be a better path, to achieve their goal that they have set out, that we may get to the desired outcome in a different way. But if you find yourself in disagreement with the overall goal or a particular strategy, and it's not something that you're comfortable facilitating, you all are bound by your ethical rules, you know this well, then you may have a conflict of interest and you may have grounds for withdrawal. But those of us that do this work find that those circumstances are really quite rare. That's because we have to remember that we represent the expressed interests of our clients, not necessarily the best interest of our clients as we see them. Of course, there are certain circumstances, whether we're representing minors or we're appointed as a guardian ad litem, where that standard of best interest may prevail. But for an ordinary, or if there's an issue of competence or capacity, then the dynamic may be different. But generally, our clients, our human trafficking survivor clients, are entitled to self-directed legal representation. What does this mean practically? Our clients may desire and request our assistance in a variety of matters that we may not think are in their best interest. They may want to seek custody of children that they are currently unable to support. They may want to spend a restitution award money on items instead of paying down debt or investing in their education. They may want to move geographic areas, believing that the services or support system somewhere else is going to be better than what they receive in your community. Being trauma-informed means not substituting our goals for theirs. We are here to use our legal tools that are available to us to seek remedy and justice as defined by our clients. So as mentioned, make sure that we take our time, but as many of us who do this work have discovered, a lot of survivors, as Jamie had mentioned, have interfaced with the criminal justice system and the legal system before. They really are quite knowledgeable about their options, so be respectful of that. Also, let's be sure to be clear about what you plan to do, what you can do, and what would be outside the scope of your work. We can't give the impression that we are their general counsel to meet all of their legal needs and even beyond their legal needs. This boundary maintenance is really important for a couple of reasons: to not prejudice the client's legal interests. If you don't intend to help with something and the expectation is that they may lose an opportunity to pursue that remedy. But it's also important to keep these boundaries so that we can maintain our ethical duties of communication and competence. And Joel mentioned that earlier about in the very beginning, in order to be competent in this work, we have to be trauma informed. So in order to do this work well, we have to have the competence, and many of us feel quite tempted to get into other areas of law for which we may not have competence. But hopefully with the growth of this work and the National Survivor Law Collective coming together and building a network, we can hopefully almost always find a competent lawyer to meet that particular survivor's legal need. So again, the client's goals, it may feel like a windy path. They may change from time to time, and your client may not show up for a protective order hearing. They may not show up for a custody hearing. They may not show up for a scheduled interview with an investigator. They may engage in commercial sex, and they may engage in criminal activity. They may just plain change their mind about what they'd like you as their lawyer to do for them. This can happen again and again, but it remains our job to ride the wave, stay patient, and do good work. So if we can advance to the next slide. Let's talk about being in court. Trafficking survivors may have to appear in court. Not all do, but they may have to appear in court for their own matters, whether it's a custody matter, speeding ticket, or as a defendant in a criminal matter. As Jamie had mentioned, they are often criminalized. Or they may be appearing in court as a victim witness in the prosecution of the trafficker or other perpetrator. Their role in these court proceedings are, of course, quite different, very different postures, but we're just going to go over some themes that would apply in any context when being in court. So we want to make the situation in court, because court for anybody, even all of us, can be a really daunting experience. So if you've had past, interface with the criminal justice system, it would be particularly daunting experience. So we'd like to make the situation as predictable as possible and to desensitize the client by perhaps rehearsing, taking a visit to the courthouse, showing pictures of the courthouse, just really even giving a mental picture to your survivor client of what you expect to happen, knowing things may change. We can't, wholly explain how things are going to unravel in the courtroom. We need to let the client know how to signal for a break. Of course, they are entitled to that in really whatever role that they play. So to make sure that they know how they're going to assert themselves in that circumstance. Have the service provider there to support the client. And certainly use of any emotional support animals or other things. I sort of learned this, through my own experiences, but all court rules, courthouses seem to really vary in how they deal with emotional support animals and other accommodations. So really, as our lawyer, it's their job to pursue and access any protections that would support them in that experience. So definitely look into that and find that out. Of course, same goes with accommodations regarding confidentiality and safety. And confidentiality and measures of safety can include looking into alternative measures of testifying. So really think as broadly as you can about what we can ask the court to institute in order to provide a trauma-informed experience for our client. And of course, have the client, if they can, work with a mental health professional before and after court experiences. It's really important that we talk with our client after the court experience. Joel had talked a lot about disassociation and the experience. If they become triggered during a court experience, they very well may not remember what happened. But of course, it's vital that they understand what happened in the matter that involved them. So we just, at a much later time, later in the day or perhaps the next day, explain what happened, and also use your legal skills to explain what that means and how that impacts their rights and their matter, whatever it was before the court. Always, if you can, leave court with your client. If not, find a trusted person to do so. Our clients can have a warranted or even an unwarranted fear for their safety in that moment, having been in a courthouse or having been near the perpetrator or the perpetrator's associates or family. So we encourage you to always make it a practice to leave with the client all the way to the car, and the car drives out of the parking garage. So that's what I have. And now we're going to shift over to vicarious trauma.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And before we do, I just want to mention one thing about preparing your clients for court in a virtual world. Many of us have virtual hearings in our cases, and we have to adapt all of these strategies to that. So thinking about how to prepare your client for a virtual court, of making sure they know exactly how to appear, making sure they have the technology they need to appear in court. Do they have a smartphone or a tablet, or can they call in? Is it important that your client is in the same place with you for that court hearing? We had a virtual family law trial, and we decided that we would do that trial in a conference room where we would all be masked and on different computers, but be able to be in the room with our client, because court is really triggering, because this is complicated, and doing it virtually just didn't make sense. And so yeah, so keep those things in mind, and also, prepare your client for, that they should be in a quiet place, that they're kind of be mindful of where they are. If they have kids, is there somebody who can, watch your kids for, 30 minutes or an hour while you have court, things like that, to just make sure that your client is fully able to participate in court if it is virtual. All right, and now switching gears a little bit to vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. If you are doing this work with human trafficking survivors, either every day or on a pro bono basis, it's inevitable that you will experience some form of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. If you're doing this work, you're an empath. And if you're not an empath, you probably shouldn't be doing this work. But that means that you're going to take in and internalize that trauma that you are hearing about from your clients. And also, many people go into this work because they have some experiences of their own that brings that passion for them. And if you have lived experience with any kind of trauma, abuse, neglect, when you work on cases, it's going to be triggering for you because it's going to bring up those past experiences. If you have children and you're working on cases involving exploitation of children or abuse of children, that could be triggering for you because you start to internalize, like, what if that was my child that happened to? So it's really important to understand what vicarious trauma is, how it manifests in you, and what you can do about it. When I started this work, I didn't know anything about vicarious trauma, and I learned about it at a training. And it was a slide similar to this slide that I saw at a training that said the symptoms of vicarious trauma. And it was a wake-up call for me because I realized I was experiencing almost all of the symptoms on that slide. And so I want you to take a moment and look at the slide of what the symptoms are. And you'll see they're very similar to the symptoms that were the slides on the symptoms of trauma. And that's because you are essentially experiencing trauma symptoms when you're experiencing vicarious trauma. And so take note of right now, today, or this week, how many of these symptoms are you experiencing or have you experienced? What about in the past couple weeks, the last month, the last year? I'm willing to bet that even if you don't work directly with trauma victims, but if you are doing work with there's so many types of work that you could be doing that you could still very much be experiencing these symptoms. And the important thing to do is to learn how it manifests in you, because for each of us, it's going to come up very differently. Some people may completely disassociate and emotionally shut down, and some people may be highly emotional. And it may be different for you on different days at different times. So it's really important. There's a time that both a colleague of mine and myself noticed that we both called it out. We said, I'm feeling really negative lately. Like, I don't know what that's about. And we're both very positive people. And when we both commented on it, we realized that that's a symptom of vicarious trauma. And that was a signal that we need to really do some work to address those symptoms. I've had my partner ask, why are you so snappy? And realize that, I'm experiencing vicarious trauma, and I didn't realize it until I was called out of that I was being really snappy. So the most important thing is to know your symptoms and to know what you need to do to address them. So, be mindful of your trauma intake levels each day. You may have some days where you're not engaging with clients at all, or if you're a pro bono lawyer, you're not working on that pro bono case. And so your trauma intake levels are low or not at all. Other days, what I call high trauma days, you go to court with a client, you do an interview, you're getting a narrative from a client about a traumatic experience. That's a pretty heavy trauma day. And, sometimes at the outset, you may know that. And if you do, plan around that. Set aside time after that meeting for yourself, set aside time at the end of the day or the next day to really, do the work that you need to do, because I have learned firsthand that on the days that I don't do that, I don't set aside time, I just try to keep it pushing, or I go from one meeting to the next, those are the times that I really get hit hard by vicarious trauma. Know what you need, and we'll get there in a second of kind of what you might need. It's really, really important to communicate with your support system. You know, we talk a lot about self-care. We're going to talk about self-care in a minute, but it's also important to think about us as caring for each other. And, you know, it's important that your support system understands what vicarious trauma is, that they know what your symptoms are, and that you have, you know, not just a one-time conversation, but an ongoing conversation about these things, so that they can not only call you up, but that they can support you through these moments and say, hey, you know, I noticed you're being really snappy today. Is there, you know, have you been doing a lot of work with your clients lately that you think might be triggering to you, or that you might be experiencing vicarious trauma? And it's very oftentimes that your support system is going to notice changes in your behavior or in how you're engaging that you might not even notice. So they have to know what it is and help you through it. Hydrating is actually really important. Taking care of your body, you know, making sure you're getting enough sleep. It's very important, because trauma is held in your body, and you have to take care of your body in order to release that trauma. It's really important that you unplug, especially on those heavy trauma days. You know, at Free to Thrive, we will say, you know, hey team, you know, I had a really, you know, tough day, or, you know, difficult day in court, and, you know, I'm going to be offline. You know, I'm taking a mental health day tomorrow, or I'm shutting it down early today. And being really respectful to your colleagues, but also holding yourself accountable. If you say you're going to take a mental health day, and then it ends up being, you know, you're getting calls and emails, you really have to unplug and shut it down, because you're going to experience these symptoms if you don't do that work for yourself. Finding healthy ways to release your trauma, because oftentimes people will have negative coping mechanisms. And I really believe that a lot of the substance use and mental health issues that we have in the legal profession are actually rooted in vicarious trauma. And none of our legal training teaches us about this, and so we don't know it. But if you look at most lawyers work with trauma victims. Every criminal lawyer works with trauma victims. You know, anybody in any of the helping fields, you know, legal aid folks, you know, anybody working with an indigent or a vulnerable population, employment lawyers, personal injury lawyers, all working with trauma victims. It's not just our, you know, us in our human trafficking field. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of challenges for us. And focus on the present, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So what does self-care mean to you? It's something that is, I feel like this term is thrown around so much, but it can mean different things to different people. You have to know what it means for you. So I would love you to put in the chat what self-care means to you. What are some of the things that you like to do to self-care? What fills your cup? What rejuvenates you? And as you put in the chat, I'm gonna list some things that work for me and some of my friends and colleagues. Certainly doing yoga and meditation. If you're fortunate enough to live near water, going to the water, it's actually, there's research on how healing and restorative it is just to put your feet in the sand. The sound of the ocean is very calming. Taking baths is actually a really, really great way to help with vicarious trauma. It's very tactile. You have scent and the warm water, and it physically helps with the stress that you're holding in your body. So I'm a big fan of bubble baths with all the candles and scents and everything. Music, going for hikes, being in nature, hanging out with your furry friends, reading books, exercising, again, hanging out with your furry friends, listening to music, all those things. And please feel free to put in the chat, you know, what some of your favorite self-care tools are. Make sure that you have a plan. So as I mentioned, you know, when you do have those heavy trauma days, you know, set the plan for yourself, calendar it out, block off your evening, and put, you know, self-care, or put hike, yoga, whatever it is that you plan to do, actually calendar it and hold yourself accountable to doing that. And then make sure you mention that to your support system and ask for what you need. Say, you know, I know I have a big court hearing today. I know I've got a client interview where we're going to be going through a lot of her trauma. So tonight I could really use a bath, or I'm going to do some yoga at the end of my workday, or whatever it is that you need to do for yourself. Ask for that, and then make sure that they also hold you accountable. One thing that I've learned from trying to work through my own vicarious trauma is that it's not enough to do one of these things. So trauma is really complicated, and you are holding this in your body. So you have to find not just one way to release it, but I really believe that you have to physically release it from your body by doing physical exercise or yoga or bubble baths or getting massage to literally get the trauma out of your body. But you also have to release it from your mind. So figuring out, what do you need to do? You may experience flashbacks from the stories you've heard. You may just, kind of continuously find yourself thinking about, something that you heard in one of your cases. And so you have to let that go somehow. So, and it also, like I said, it may be triggering your own experiences, and you have to process that. You have to understand, what is it about this client's story that's really triggering me? And so the things that I found that work really well are going to therapy, journaling, talking to friends and family, but being mindful, of course, of client confidentiality, but also not dumping your trauma on them. But you could say, I had a meeting with a client, today, and it's really sticking with me, and I'm having a really hard time. And just having a conversation about, why it might be that this is triggering to you, or even just saying, I'm struggling, and, asking for a hug, or, whatever it is that you need in that moment. It's also great to have some sort of spiritual release, and that's different for every person. It can be prayer for some people, but it could also be meditation or yoga. It could be just being in nature. It is very restorative. Mindfulness as a practice is a really important part of transforming vicarious trauma. Mindfulness at its core is grounding yourself in the present moment through breath, through all of your senses of knowing, kind of feeling the room around you and where you are. And if you're experiencing vicarious trauma, your body is somewhere else, your mind is somewhere else, because it's bringing you back to your client's trauma, to your own trauma. And the way to help address that is to ground yourself in the present moment. The same way that Joel was saying, if your client is triggered, bring them back to the present moment. You need to do that for yourself. And you can use an app like the Calm app or another mindfulness app and listen to a 5 or 10 minute meditation. You can, there's many meditations on YouTube and other places. Or you could just literally just do breathing exercises. There's tons and tons of them, but literally just spending 1 minute just focusing on your breath, closing your eyes and breathing in slowly and exhaling slowly. That's enough to ground yourself in the present moment. And your breath is a really powerful way to calm your nervous system. And so if you find your heart racing, or you find yourself feeling symptoms of vicarious trauma, always bring yourself back to the present moment and ground yourself in your breath. And just a few resources that we wanted to share with all of you before we wrap up, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions. First, Free to Thrive released our Trauma-Informed Legal Representation of Human Trafficking Survivors Practice Guide recently, and we will share a link to that in the chat if you're interested in checking it out. In addition to that, Alight has an amazing resources, tips for attorneys working with trafficking survivors. We'll drop that in the chat as well. As a collective, at the outset of COVID, the NSL Collective released our Survivors Speaks report, when we looked at the impact of COVID on the legal needs of trafficking survivors. And very recently, the Avery Center, in collaboration with the National Survivor Law Collective, published the Legal Deserts report. And this report really helps us all understand how there is a huge gap in legal services for human trafficking survivors. And we're all working on a second report to follow on to that, of what we can all do as a society, as a community, to respond to those gaps. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Joel.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. We want to just add a few calls to action for those of you that want to engage further in this and connect with us. Certainly you can approach us individually with questions. We're going to show our contact information just after this. But please follow us on LinkedIn. The NSL Collective has a LinkedIn page. The link is there, but you can search for us on LinkedIn. You can send us an email to join our listserv. So it doesn't get a lot of traffic. It's not going to blow up your inbox, but we encourage you to join our NSLC listserv. So send an email to nslcollective@gmail.com. And if you are in the DC area or are able to come, we encourage you to join us for a legal framework type of day at the Shared Hope Just Conference, which is going to be in November from the 17th to the 19th. November 17th, a Wednesday, will be the day oriented towards legal issues for attorneys. We're going to be presenting a CLE over the noon hour. There will be some other workshops that day. And you can find out more about the Just Conference by going to Shared Hope's website.
All right, and we have all of our contact information here. It's on 2 slides, so I'll click over to the next one in just a moment. But we're happy to start taking your questions as we do that. And I see
Amy, I'm going to read some questions for the panelists.
Thank you.
We have 2 good questions, and they are very similar to one another, so I'm going to just combine them into one for the panelists. So one challenge we have, and this is the general we coming from the question box, one challenge we have with clients is sometimes their trauma impacts their memories of events, and their memory does not comport with objective and compelling evidence. Does anyone have any suggestions on the best ways to tell clients that their version of events is, for lack of a better word, wrong? Why don't we start with any one of the, as Jamie and Joel are on video. So either one of you, if you want to go.
Yeah, I can address that. I mean, that is a great question because it's a real problem and it can manifest in a lot of different ways. One can be that whatever that extrinsic evidence that you're responding to might be based on a faulty memory at the beginning. So for example, if a police officer interviews somebody who's been traumatized, what they told the police officer at that time may not have been accurate. And so now, because they had an inability to remember what was happening and they felt under pressure to give an answer, there's lots of different reasons why the earlier version might not be the same as their current memory. And so for me, the approach that I've used, and others may disagree, is to tell the survivor, whatever you remember now is what we're going to stick with. And we're going to try to contextualize previous evidence. But if this is your current memory, then don't try to change what your version is based on other evidence, but try to figure out maybe how to explain why there are some differences. And that may just be in terms of explaining trauma and explaining that, trauma has impaired someone's ability to form a consistent, coherent narrative, but it is a real challenge. And so I'm interested to know if others have experienced that and how they adapt to it.
And just a few things to add on to that. We do our best to one, try to figure out, what it is that we can verify, either through, corroborating evidence. If there's anything that we can figure out that might corroborate pieces of the story, we might, it depends on the context of this. I know I saw Chris asking in the chat what's the context, and Tammy works at Free to Thrive, so I know the context is usually in vacatur petitions of getting a narrative of their trafficking story so that we can help clear their records. And so in those situations, in a case where we're talking about vacatur, it's going to be different for different types of cases. But for vacatur, some things we may be able to corroborate and some we may not. For the things that we can corroborate, maybe from family members or from documents, some things for example, if they say, you know, I dropped out of school mid-semester because I was being trafficked, we'll actually get the transcripts and be able to show the withdrawals from that semester. And we actually did that in one of our cases where they were getting straight A's and then it's just W's across their transcript. That corroborates their story. Sometimes the timeline may be totally off of when they thought something happened versus when it did. And we can figure out the correct timeline based on their criminal record report or based on other documents that we're able to gather. But if we don't know, you know, the question I always ask myself is how relevant is that detail? Or is there a way that we can word it that it will be the closest to accurate? Or is there some sort of language that we can say of, to the best of my recollection, or around this time, I think it was in 1995, you know, some sort of kind of couching language to say, you know, that way it's not like it was on May 5th of 1995. If we don't know it was May 5th, then don't say it was May 5th, right? Also, can you use other dates to at least figure out the timeline? So we have one client who has 6 children, and she had such a hard time. Remember, her trafficking happened over a very, very long period of time. She had a really hard time remembering when things happened chronologically, but she remembers all of her kids' birthdays. She remembers where she was living at the time. When Joey was learning to walk, we lived in this place. And then by the time, Joey was in elementary school, we were living in this other place. Oh, I see it's okay. And so, we're able to put together that timeline based on, dates that they do recall. Was it before or after Joey was born? Did it happen between when Joey and Sally were born? Things like that of figuring out what dates they do know and then putting it in the middle without having to specify a date. It was between this time and this date that this happened. And then if, it depends on how important those details are. And I see, sorry, there's in the chat, I see it's Nick, not Tammy. Sorry, Nick. And I'm not going to read, I can't read this while I'm talking, so I'll read it and then we'll respond. But Sarah, did you have something to add to that?
I was just going to add, since I spoke about techniques, a method that I've found useful is after you've talked with a client about these circumstances and now you're questioning the facts, is to, when you meet again or talk again, to say that you've gone over your notes and kind of, I guess, read them back to the client. I know the person who asked the question doesn't want to re-traumatize, but sometimes, of course, in order to get our work done, sometimes we need to go over these facts. And if we can get the client comfortable telling this story to us a couple of times, it actually might make it easier in other contexts. So I don't think it's all that harmful to go over it. But I found lots of times when I say, okay, when we last met, you described the situation as this. And a lot of times the client will say, wait, no, that's not what happened. And it's kind of a work in progress to get it to in its most accurate form. And then the other thing I was going to say in the context of if your client is serving as a victim witness is that a good prosecutor will certainly pay attention to this. If your client's being impeached by a criminal defense attorney, that the prosecutor will seek to rehabilitate your client when they're back on the stand, and either through expert testimony talk about all the impact of trauma we're talking about today, or just refocus your client on what information is important and what he or she remembers in this moment.
Do we have any other questions from the audience before we wrap up? Just one last thought on this, the 2 questions that we had is, I think there's this fine line to walk of validating their experience and understanding that their memories may be different from what actually happened, and finding language that doesn't say I don't believe you, or that's not what happened, but understanding that is your client's experience. And memory is fascinating because it's malleable, right? Just last week, my wife and I had a discussion argument about did this happen on Friday or Saturday? And at the end of the day, we both were I'm like, no, it happened on Friday. And she's like, no, it happened on Saturday. And it was a week later. And at the end of the day, it was does it really matter if it happened Friday or Saturday? We both were whatever. And we went on with the conversation and understand, like, even without trauma, even, just in our day to day, like our memories are, they could be different and somebody can experience something differently. And so it still can be, it's that person's experience, and it's important to validate their experience and understand that that could have a serious impact for your case if your client remembers it differently than other witnesses, and figuring out how to not, discount their experience of what they experienced from, if it maybe didn't happen that way, or you're not sure how it did happen. Well, with that, thank you all so much for attending today, for being a part of this training, and for being a part of our collective. We hope that you will attend our future trainings. We hope to see you at Just Conference, and please join our listserv so that we can connect with all of you in the future. Take care.